So welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast. This is where we explore the new game-changing understanding that can unlock new levels of performance, resourcefulness, and well-being in the workplace. Join us if you want to be part of the new breed of leaders in business. Join us if you're fed up with the conventional echo chamber. And join us if you want to be part of the new revolution in understanding how the mind works and recognize that we are more than just our psychology and that can lead to better results.
Hello and welcome to the Quality of Mind Transforming Business podcast series. So today's episode, another conversation lined up. This one all about the wonderful world of relationships in business. I'm lucky enough to be joined by Kate Adey to help us explore this wonderful topic. So, Kate, welcome to the show. And could you just to start with give listeners just a couple of minutes on your background and how come we're having this conversation?
Great, Piers, and super to be here. Yeah, I've got a corporate background going over 20 years in consulting, mainly management consulting, worked across industry, worked a lot in kind of CRM, moved into change management, then actually worked in a very small specialized leadership development and coaching consultancy firm. And it was there really that I fell in love with coaching and was coaching a lot of business leaders across sort of FTSE 100 companies and also doing group work, but I just loved doing the one-on-one work. And it was whilst I was doing that coaching work that I also actually did a master's in management learning and leadership and did a specialist dissertation on transitioning to and from the workplace when becoming a parent. My coaching that I absolutely loved was something that I then wanted to pursue myself. So I set up my own business in 2000, Kate Adey Coaching. And I would definitely say that my coaching has evolved since then. I mean, 2008, long time ago. I was back then really focused on NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, looking at positive psychology, Gestalt. I had sessions at the Tavistock, psychoanalytic, and really focused on helping people to look at how they could change their behaviors and do that sustainably. Now, I began to question, I suppose, what's underpinning all those models? What's the source? I still am a very curious learner, curious coach. And it was through that questioning that I came across the three principles and the work of Michael Neal and many others in that area. And it then triggered really the pursuit of continuing to question and meet different people in different groups. So I met some people in non-duality, which is really where, Piers, I came across yourself when you were interviewing the wonderful Rupert Sparrow. And we then got in touch, and here we are having this amazing, going to have this great conversation. So looking forward to it.
Great. I mean, for listeners that know me, you'll see some similarity between Kate's background and mine, being in the corporate world, being in the world of coaching, but through the kind of conventional models and approaches that has, and then drifting into three principles and then into non-duality. So very similar background, Kate. So no wonder we're talking. But also on today's topic,
absolutely,
having had that exposure to the corporate world for many decades that you have, it's probably fair to say you've come across the odd business relationship or two, and how important it is in businesses, in organizations, that the dynamics between individuals, between teams, between leaders and their colleagues, leaders and their teams, between people and their stakeholders, their sponsors, let alone suppliers, customers, is absolutely key. So communication, relationships is fundamental for organizational effectiveness and having a successful, happy time at work, isn't it really? So what a great topic we're going to get to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just I don't think there's anyone who's listening to this that can't say that they've not come across some powerful and wonderful conversations, and also those they may be a bit tricky, feel different. And
absolutely.
I think it would be great almost to do a bit of a compare and contrast of before knowing non-duality and actually understanding what that can bring to one's life and therefore relationships, what are we looking at? What are we trying to do in order to improve relationships versus when one has a sense of going upstream, and some of the language that you used on many of your podcasts, Piers, of going before the psychology. What does that bring then to relationships?
Well, let's do that, Kate. So let's do a little example for listeners of how maybe 10, 15 years ago we would have helped people see relationships and how to have a better one, and how we would see it now. And that may give people a bit of a hint of what's available with this wonderful understanding we call quality of mind, and what we're leaving behind really, but by not seeing it. So Kate, if you've got any examples that we could use here of then and now that you want to use?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Piers, maybe if we both go if we go sort of back into my corporate days, and I can actually sort of think of an example of, for myself, of a leader who had a very different style, different way, and I felt myself wanting to try and make that better. I was wanting to improve it, I wanted to make it sort of feel better, more comfortable. And the same sort of thing would come up with clients, where they would sit down and go, well, I don't really get on with my boss, and I'm struggling to know what to do. It just doesn't work. We can't communicate well together. And therefore I'm just feeling sort of stuck in knowing what to do. Now, back then, with a sort of coachee with that sort of predicament, and even myself, I would be looking at, okay, so maybe it's about rapport. Are you noticing how kind of their body language and your body language, and noting, are you kind of noticing their eye movements? So it would be very much focused on kind of the observation of the individual, but also trying to mirror them, and then also looking at language. So connecting, listening, but listening in a way that is to their words, and maybe playing back something, reflecting back, or go, oh yes, I hear what you said there. So I think all the little tweaks and nudges and skills and tips, and for myself and for, let's say, for my coachee, were on those bits. Does that?
Yeah, I think for my NLP days, NLP, for those people that aren't aware, is neuro-linguistic programming, right? So the middle L is linguistic. And we used to do a lot of monitoring, if you like, of language patterns to try and help understand someone's motivational style, or some of the normalizations they use, or some of the language patterns they use. And then once you understand that, you can kind of try and, I suppose at the worst case, manipulate, but at the best case, align yourself with how they see the world, so that you can then get a closer sense of understanding of what they're on about. So that'd be one thing we do in NLP. They're also the rapport. So we try and, as you say, mirror body language, breathing, all that kind of stuff. And it had some effect, right? It had some effect. I would say definitely, because I did it for 10 years. So it kind of completely pointless.
What did you see? What were the effects? What kind of
results? I think what would happen is it would find it easier for people to get on the same page, right? But it was quite hard work, in that you had to be in your head quite a bit, working it out a little bit, and it would be quite analytical, and you might have to do some planning and think, well, that person does that, or you'd have to really kind of watch your own language to try and do it. So it was quite psychologically tiresome, or tiring, should I say? Maybe tiresome. And it had some effect. So it wasn't pointless, and you could probably get the conversation to be a bit better than it was. And maybe you're doing better than your colleagues, so you thought, well, yippity do. But it only occasionally was game changing. And I think when it was game changing, it wasn't for the reasons we probably thought it was. So if we take the fact that back in the day, we would look at it like, well, I need to get an alignment with this person. I need to build rapport with them. I need to understand how their mind works. We'd say things like that. I need to understand how their mind works, and the language they use gives you clues about their motivational direction, about their chunk size preference. We had all these, they were called meta programs that we would look at. That's about, I remember about 8 of them. We used to go through them and go, well, where's the person on this, to try and kind of almost analyze it. Or you do a psychometric, or you do an assessment and go, well, that person likes this kind of communication style, or this kind of trait, or whatever it is. And I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I don't know how this is for you, but where I would start now will be a completely different place. Right?
And
different place.
And Piers, there's something as you were talking that popped into my mind, is there's a lot of doing. There's quite a lot of noise there, isn't there? And my reflections on the relationships, there's a lot of trying and talking to make it better. Whereas in fact, what we're going to be pointing to is in fact when there's silence, without knowing that the silence is actually what is potentially allowing things to fall away. We'll come into that in a minute. But I'm just going to have an observation that we do a lot of more talking sometimes, and it's in not knowing that in fact.
Well, I think you think the power.
We think the power
to change is in the communication content.
Yes.
Right. So you think, well, how shall I? So I think this is why I'm saying we start in a very different place, because you kind of, well, the interesting thing is the first thing that we were doing back then as coaches is kind of assuming that our client's reality, or the reality that we saw, was some kind of right. Oh, that person is difficult. Oh, that situation is frustrating or creates anxiety or whatever. So we would give, I think there was probably less than the coachee, but even the coach was giving the situation some degree of causal power. Right. So the first thing I kind of would see differently was when I would, let's say I'm talking to a coachee now, and they're saying, well, this boss he's a difficult guy. Everyone thinks he's a difficult guy or something. I would automatically go, well, that's how you see it right now. But I wouldn't buy into the truth of that. Yeah. I'd see it as a real, as regular listeners know, real but never true, something occurring on the screen of perception for that client. So they're not lying, they're not pretending, they're not making it up, they're not being weak or anything. It's just how they see it. But I wouldn't think, no, that human being is difficult, intrinsically hardwired to be difficult. Yeah. I think the first place we're saying is we're going in differently. In the old days, I would have gone in hoping and believing people could be different and change. Yes. Right? Because I'd seen that happen before, so why not here? Yeah. Right? But I think the difference now is that I would not hope and believe. I would more neutrally just go, well, of course it can be different. I'm not saying it will be definitely, but there's no need to believe or hope. It's just it's there. It's in the capacity of any single human being to have a shift in how they see things. That isn't the same as saying it's going to happen, because it may not, but there's no one immune to seeing things differently. Some people may have more conditioning in the way, but you're less thinking, well, this is kind of true, isn't it? And this is a very difficult one. You're much more neutral. You're less attached to your client's reality is the first point. Right? Now, that doesn't mean you don't respect your client's reality. Of course you do. But you just see that that's just how they see it. And that's just a situation. So then to your point, which I think is so important, isn't it? Where we then thought the power laid was in the having different content of what to say to this person. That's how you thought the relationship would change. You think it would change, yes, by shifting the content, or even not just the words, but the tonality of the content. Yeah. So you'd look at what words am I going to say to this person, and how shall I say them? Shall I say them in a tone that's more like this? And more like that? That's how we thought the power is. Now, you were just starting to point to the fact that now we look somewhere a bit different to where we believe the power is. Can you say a bit more of that?
Well, in terms of the real but not true.
Well, I think more in terms of, I was thinking now in what we are, and to use, if I'm going to give the quality of mind code language, the self and I, to see that actually, if what we're made of and what we truly are, all of us, any of us, you recognize that actually the power isn't in what we create in the world of form between us, although it can look like that. We recognize there's something underlying.
Yeah, and
Our very being.
absolutely. And I'm in that. I'm just wondering whether, because you were pointing to, we could use the content a lot to try and change and improve the communication or the relationship. But actually, if we can, one, as you were saying, notice the separate realities, or that the reality of it we have separate realities, but also there's no causal result or in that. If the boss says something to me one day and it's not very nice, we think that that's created an inside feeling, a feeling in myself, whereas actually to know it just doesn't work that way.
Yes. So there's no causal power in anything, and no one can say anything that would make us feel anything, which gives us more psychological freedom to deal with whatever's going on. But the bit I really wanted to start to unpack for people was, if we're not saying in order to change a relationship, you need to necessarily just focus on what you say or how you say it, what is the thing that changes how people relate to each other, right? If it's not in the content of the words or how you say the words, which is where we used to point, right? We're saying there's the recognition that we can all have of what we are, all of us,
knowing
any of us, which is to start to recognize the very nature of our being is a shared being. Now, forget for a moment whether we like someone or don't like them, or agree with them or don't agree with them. That's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about before that. We're saying that we can get a sense and a recognition, and we're innately doing this as humans anyway, but it gets covered up. Just look at little kids to see that we are all one thing. We have a shared consciousness, a shared being. We're all made of the same stuff. Now, that can sound, for some people, and there might be listeners right now going, well, that sounds a bit silly or trite or woo-woo or abstract or, oh, God, spiritual, whatever. It can sound a bit like that to say we're one being. So, but what we do in our work now, isn't it? We directly point people to see that for themselves, because there's so much power that comes from that. Now, if someone's listening to this going, well, how do I know I've got a shared being? But what do you mean shared? How do we know that it's what I am before my thoughts is exactly the same as someone else? And I think we can get a little feel for that sometimes when you're in a beautiful conversation with your friends and you're just hanging out and there's nothing on it. You kind of lose yourself into the being of that conversation, and there's this, you actually lose the sense of separation. You're just in this beautiful time, maybe it gets distorted, and we all get that lovely warm feeling, if I just use the word warm, which is why we like hanging out with our friends, or why we like going to a music concert or a football match, and we just get wrapped up in the fact that there's lots of people there. And we're recording this podcast in 2022 January, where we've just had a year or two of not being able to share things with other people in person, in proximity, and we've kind of missed that. So if we didn't have a shared being, we wouldn't miss that at all, right? This doesn't need proximity to work. We can have a shared consciousness over the internet, but there's something about seeing the impersonal nature of what we are within the apparent other, if you like, recognizing what we truly are within someone else, and we lose ourselves in that. And an extreme example is when we fall in love. And I know this is a business podcast, but we'll allow ourselves to indulge. When you fall in love, listeners, if you can remember that, you lose who you are and you become one with the other person. I know it's a bit rose tinted and there's lots of songs written about it, but that's what we're pointing to. Now, that happens in the business world when we're in a great business team, or the organizations, when we really just sync with people, and we love going to work because there's something about being part of what that is that touches us. And actually we can see it in nature as well. It's this whatever this is isn't just in people, it's just in everything. And we kind of can sense it, but it's hard to put words on it, but there's something there. And it's lovely, isn't it, in the work we do? Sometimes when we work with teams and we're asking them to really brainstorm or ideate on something new, they're trying to find a solution to something, they kind of, something emerges from the conversation. It wasn't one person saying it. It just sort of came out and no one really knows who said it. And everyone's like, yeah, that. But there's a vibe in the room where you've got into sort of almost like a sort of special, emergent, coming out of the nothingness idea. Which really feels it, that they talk about team synergy, with 2 + 2 = 5. Right, you're more than the sum of your parts. That's the secret sauce we're pointing to here.
And I suppose that sense of, this is a great team. I've had experience of that as well, where working with few individuals and facilitating a session, and there's just that nothingness between us. We're just there. With that the shared, and kind of almost because we are that shared being, our ego or apparent separate self does not get in the way. Because I think that's the big, I suppose, pointer, is that if we begin to sense that shared being, we can be in the workplace and look at others around us, or be those on the screen if we're still doing home working, that removes the apparent self talking to another self, and the separation, and therefore potential conflict, which only arises really at the level of thought. Whereas if we can just have that, you're beginning to have that sense of shared being, so much benefit in that.
And I'm going to give it a sort of a stepping stone, middle step for listeners on this, because they might go,
that seems...
I do have a separate self, and it really doesn't like that other separate self, right? Or I struggle with that separate self. So I think because what seems to happen is we can sort of see ourselves as both. We can have a sense that we are this one shared being, and we can resonate and have a sense of that. And then we can also really identify with what our conceptual mind comes up with about who we are, who they are, and why we don't get on, right? Because you might go, well, hang on a minute. Are you saying I need to, let's take some extreme people from history like Genghis Khan or Hitler. Am I meant to just like be, oh yeah, we're all loved together, I have no problem with what Hitler was up to, or whoever it is? Are we meant to be doing that? Is that what you're suggesting? Well, what we're actually suggesting is to go, well, start to see that, yes, we have a shared being with every single human being, right? We have a shared being, and we are that shared being. And yet we also localize into our own alters or our own egos, which have a view on this made up thing we call a world. And that may well be different to yours. That doesn't mean we don't have a shared being with them. And that doesn't mean we can't operate from seeing we have a shared being, yet on the screen of perception and how we see it, we have differences. So, and by keep coming back to the shared being, it allows us to navigate, understand, get curious about those shared differences in a way where the ego doesn't feel it needs to attack or defend. Because often what we do is that when someone else has a different view to us, particularly on something fundamental like religion or moral compass, like what they think is right or wrong in the world, our self-ego gets, it feels, it goes, hang on a minute, what if you're saying that? That's different to what I think, therefore you're saying something wrong about me. If you see the world like that, and I see the world like this, you are telling me there's something wrong with me and my worldview. And then our ego protects or resists or doesn't like it, right? Because you think someone is having a go at the core of you, and we get insecure. And then when we get insecure, we try to defend, or we try and attack, if you like. Now, if we can see that our shared being and what we truly are before the self, as you mentioned, before thought, if we can see that that cannot be damaged, affected, is absolutely ring-fenced, regardless to what any other of these, it isn't saying anything about who I am, because who I am is before the self. It's just a difference of view on the screen of perception. Then that allows us to have so much more resourcefulness, bandwidth, love, compassion, understanding, curiosity to navigate and deal with those separate realities. And somehow also, not only that, the being that we resonate with and what we give off is less angsty, and actually you're more likely for that other separate realities views to slightly mold and change and dissolve. Not because you're telling them that, oh, you need to think like me, just because there's a space of kind of where we get to where our egoic view of the world does start to dissolve. And it's interesting. Now, I've just rambled on for about a few minutes there, Kate. I just wonder whether, what did you hear in that that you might want to really succinctly reiterate for people listening?
Well, I think you've pulled it together really well. And I think for those, and particularly because we're focusing on corporate, is tapping into, or just taking on board that there is more to see beyond the self, and to begin to inquire into that being and that shared being, and I'm not sure I can succinctly bring this all together, but to notice that sense of freedom and light, and if we use the word love, because absolutely from that shared being and that understanding and feeling, entering into conversations that might be a bit tricky, you'll be able to navigate just in a way that is less caught up in one's apparent ego. And there's a real lightness, and this is kind of almost the nugget. I think if more and more conversations within corporates and teams were from this place, from looking at from this shared being, there would be more love and a sense of one that then allows things to happen and emerge from that place, rather than from sort of what we were saying earlier in terms of trying to improve the self and improve communication, and from that point. So it may seem a giant leap, but it is where it is on offer. It is there for us all to. It's available for all of us,
isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
the beauty of it.
It hides, doesn't it? Because sometimes when you're squished up against it and your aperture is contracted, it really looks like that person is a problem, or that relationship's a problem, or whatever it is. And it's so hard to see when you're squished up that this is nothing to do with the mind and it's to do with them or you. Now, most listeners will have had times when they've had a big kind of challenge with someone, and then later on it's been better. So we know it can change, but we know when we're squished up against it, it really does look very real, what we would say real and true, right? Now, the little example or metaphor that popped in my mind, actually, Kate, as you were talking, was, let's imagine you're acting in a play, and in the play you have an argument with a fellow actor, right? That's what your characters have to do. They have to have a big Barney about something. Mm-hmm. Now, as soon as the director sort of says, "Oh, time for lunch," right? Time out. I'm assuming people will then very happily go and be in a loving space with their fellow actor, right? Even though they just had a big Barney, because they know that what the actors were saying was nothing to do with, they wouldn't take it personally.
Yeah.
Right? They wouldn't go, well, hang on a minute, you said some pretty horrible things to me back there.
Yeah.
We wouldn't say that because we know it's not what we truly are, right?
Yeah.
In that
Wonderful to use that stage analogy. I think it's,
So
really
now what we forget is because we think we are me, I think what someone else thinks and believes and says can affect me, or it can affect my career and therefore my financial security, or my sense of how clever I am, or whether I'm liked, maybe. So there, and then when someone doesn't see the same reality as me, I can then get into my thinking about it, and then I stop listening. I start judging myself or judging others or the situation, and before I know it, I'm squished up and I can't see what's really going on. And I suppose what we're doing in our coaching nowadays is, rather than, if I use the metaphor of the actor, giving the actor a better script to solve why they've fallen out with their friend, is to make them realize what they truly are and what's available. Because when that aperture does open, it's amazing, isn't it? The ability to communicate the right things in the right tonality just comes out of your mouth. I mean, I might just use an example that happened for us last week, Kate, because we were facilitating a group, weren't we? And without any prompting at all, we had this lovely little interaction, didn't we, between two of the delegates? Well, one of them was sort of being a little bit anxious and concerned about how they'd come across recently in some business conversations, and was a bit concerned about it, or maybe I wasn't being understanding enough, maybe I was being a bit short with people. And the colleague just turned around to them and for about 2 minutes just gave the most beautiful piece of feedback, which we couldn't have ever scripted or coached into someone, right? It was just coming from such a place of honesty and vulnerability and love, and it moved their colleague to a place of tears. They were actually all crying at one point, weren't they? And that's nothing I think we could have scripted or created from the conceptual mind. That was in the moment, just in that space of expression coming from a very impersonal place, and it was amazing to watch, and the whole room shifted. Wasn't it a lovely thing?
It was lovely, and it just, as you're saying that, it takes me to business meetings where I've spoken to coachees who have sat in meetings having a meeting in their head. Now and what shifts is when they're next in a meeting is to be able to, just like that lady is, you've just given an example, and I was there, it was heartfelt and just coming from that space, is in a meeting, rather than having a meeting with yourself and just having, I'm not sure I should say that, or what would they think if I say that, and gosh, that's going to be detrimental to my career if I mention that, or gosh, I'm remaining silent. They're going to look at me as though I don't know anything. All those kind of just layers of invisible lids that one puts on oneself. To go into that same meeting, knowing that you have a shared being, and knowing that these ideas, inspired thoughts appear in the moment when they're needed, allows one to just be and tune in to what is okay, I don't necessarily agree with that person, but I'm going to ask a question. It just happens. You don't have to. The overthinking slows down and disappears, stops, and doesn't get in the way anymore.
I, in my coaching career, have had so many conversations, if I think about it now, with coachees about how can I fix this conversation, this communication, this relationship with this person. And basically, when you get into it, well, what's the problem? And they start reeling off all the things they think this person thinks, and all the things that have happened in the past as to why they think this, so it's justified, right? And then they start judging what they think might happen if they were to go around route A, B, C, D, or E. And none of this is real time. This is all like when we're post-morteming a conversation or trying to plan another conversation. And the amount of thinking and effort that the conceptual mind applies to it is amazing. Now, the funny thing is, isn't it, or the paradox or the irony is that when you are in flow, as we would call it, in that wide aperture, what you need to know about that person and conversation just comes out of your mouth. in the right way, in the right space. And it's so easy.
Yeah, it is effortless. So a
Um,
real, yeah. I mean, I don't know, Piers, whether we sort of move into to the aperture, and just because you've mentioned it a couple of times there, I'm just sort of wondering whether that might be a very
Well, yes. I mean, it
Yeah.
might be worth mentioning. I mean, again, for regular listeners, they'll know exactly what you mean. But I think in the context of relationships, what we're pointing to here is in Quality of Mind, we have this this thing we ask people. It's a metaphor, of course. We call it the aperture, and it's how it determines how we see the world in any moment and what our level of resourcefulness in that perceived world is. And when we're in a very contracted aperture, it looks like the world is difficult, stressful, full of people who are hard to understand and get to align with. And we feel we feel it. We feel all that. And that's how the world looks when we're in that aperture. When we're in an expanded aperture, we're much more in flow, and we recognize that we've all got this kind of in the moment everyday genius that can occur to us, that we have a way of being that will bring around results, and we're just much more dynamic and in the flow. So that's broadly the aperture. Now, what we've been conditioned to believe is that the aperture you're in is usually either to do with the kind of person I am. Well, I'm a kind of person that has a contracted aperture, or they are, or we think it's to do with the circumstances. So we might say, well, in some circumstances, I can be in a really great aperture, but when it comes to talking about the budgets, or when it comes to talking about this particular project, then because it's so difficult and complex, or the people are difficult and complex, my aperture is contracted. So we tend to think that the aperture is caused by the situation or circumstance, or by the type of person I am. And that, we're saying, is not the case, right? The aperture determines the world you see, right? Not the world determines your aperture. And that's one of the biggest mistakes we get into. And when we start thinking the aperture is determined by the situation or the person, of course, we then think, well, I can't be in a better aperture about this until the situation changes, right? Or the person changes. So we have to flip it around and go, oh, the fact that this person's looking difficult, this situation's looking challenging, isn't telling me anything about the person or the situation. It's just feedback about the aperture. And then when we recognize that, we can go, okay, this is looking like this because of the aperture I'm in. Now, when the aperture changes, this will look different and feel different. And basically, the aperture will change when I recognize what I truly am and see the real and never trueness of it. So that's the whole. Now, I've tried to summarize aperture there in about 3 or 4 minutes. I don't know whether that worked. Kate, anything you'd like to add?
No, I just think it's a very good way, particularly the way that aperture could be used in terms of thinking that it's someone else or in the external circumstances. I think that kind of links back to what we were saying at the beginning. And I think this gives an opportunity for listeners and new listeners to be able to look at their own screen of perception, what they are seeing as real and true, and to begin to question that, and just seeing the aperture as the barometer or the signpost of what the world appears to them, what it appears to, we use it as that way of indicating what the world is looking like to them. So I think it's a great way in to begin to kind of take it in your life, if you like, day to day, and just sort of say, just sense check. Okay.
Okay, that's quite a nice little summary you've done there. Let's just do that again for listeners, because I think it's so important. So what we're saying is, if there are a few things to take from this podcast, and listeners, we'd always love to hear what you think, but let's give you a few pointers on what we think you could take away from this podcast. So one point would be, when you're looking at a relationship or a situation, how it feels. If it feels, difficult, I'm a bit avoiding that one, or I'm a bit anxious about that one, or I'm annoyed about that one, or I'm angry about that one, that sensation that we believe might be coming from the situation or the person is actually only ever an indicator to the aperture that you're in that moment. So that's point one, is that how a situation or a relationship feels is a sensational indicator to the aperture. And if it's feeling all those icky things that I just mentioned, that's showing you're in a contracted aperture. So and then once we spot, oh, this isn't the situation or them, it's the aperture I'm in, we can then go, yeah, and actually I'm seeing this as real and true. I'm seeing there's causal power in what's going on. I'm giving the person causal power. I think the situation can make me feel like this. I'm seeing the world as real and true. So that's sort of point 2. And then we can start to go, well, hang on a minute. If I understand what I truly am, if I understand what we're pointing to about this shared being, that I'm not this self, I'm not my thoughts, feelings, perceptions. There's something else that I am truly behind the peers, behind the Kate, behind the thought, behind the thing. If I can truly know that I am that and fall back into that, and it can take seconds, just seconds for that to happen, there's then a dissolving or a loosening of that perceived reality. And then the aperture starts to expand. And then we start to have a new way of seeing, and a new level of resourcefulness comes in, which will know how to listen, will know how to just get curious about the situation, but coming from a space of just curiosity, love and understanding, rather than I need to fix this, defend myself, attack them or whatever. And that's how we would point our clients to see the nature of communication, relationships, and synergy in the world of organizations and business. Now, does that little summary make sense to you, Kate?
That makes total sense. Beautifully pulled together, and as much as an action orientated sort of ending, and I suppose with the flavor of curiosity and inquiry being a part of your sort of everyday life. When we ask a lot of sort of intellectual, cognitive questions, the conceptual mind goes overboard. And a lot of corporate life, we can spend so much time. It's almost like the engine gets so burnt out because it's just overused. And what we're pointing to here is a very light, effortless way beginning to notice that actually that's the burnout. The car can actually run more smoothly.
And actually, it's a good point, because I was going to sort of finish on the question. What I said there can sound incredibly simple. So why don't we do it more? Right? Why doesn't it happen? Well, it's not really doing. But why doesn't that happen more? And I think you've just pointed to it. It's because we're addicted to thinking, right? We're addicted to that conceptual mind deciding what's going on and trying to work things out with its smart intellectual. Oh, I'm going to do some Socratic questioning on this, or I'm going to recognize that person on the disc was a this, or I'm a this. So our mind just jumps straight into trying to fix it, work it out, analyze it at the conceptual mind level, and completely innocently misses what we're pointing to.
Yeah. And I've got to be better than Jane and Bob, and that going on as well, particularly in the corporate world. So not only working it out, but also I've got to work it out to be better than the other people, and I'm not good enough. So that all goes on as well. So it's really revved up.
And people like to do something they can tangibly grip and control and manage, and thinking is very tangible. We can wrestle with our thoughts. We can have better ones, we can have worse ones according to our mind, of course, and it's very tangible. So I'm going to go away and think about this, and people would even some reflection. People sort of slightly misunderstand. They think, I'm going to go and reflect on this conversation. That's kind of okay, but not if you're doing it in a very thinky, conceptual way, because we need fresh thought and insight to come through. So I think what stops this happening more, and people seeing the power of it, is our innocent conditioning that we've been relied to look at the conceptual mind and everything that produces, because it's more tangible and kind of been relied on to do other things. That's how we go. Yeah. That's where we rely on. Now, actually, when we were, even in the old days of our coaching, Kate, getting breakthroughs, it wasn't because of what we were doing. We just thought it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
We were taking credit for it, or we would take,
little did we know.
Good to think this through, we would say. Good, we think this through. Now, what we really mean is, what we really would say now is, well, actually, the thinking's dissolved and fresh has come through, but it wasn't anything to do with our conceptual mind.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is there anything that you want to, as we're going towards time, any sort of little snippet you want to leave people with? If there was one thing to do as a result of having a listen to this, what would you leave listeners with, Kate?
I would just, note I think the addiction to thinking and overthinking, and then to look at the piece on the aperture that you could so nicely brought together, to re-listen to that and just close one's eyes, take a quiet moment, and just digest it and take it in. It's very different. I've been there I think Piers has as well, in terms of the overthinking, overanalyzing, living in thought, believing it. And I think it's so remarkably effortless when one begins to see what is already there. It's not hard work. Yeah.
And I think, listeners, I'll just say that even if 90% of this podcast has made no sense, but there's something in it that you've resonated with, right? Because don't worry, the conceptual mind will try and work it out. But if there's something that you resonate with rather than understand, get in contact with Kate or I'll put her details in the show notes, and let's have a proper conversation about it. So these podcasts are really meant just to see whether there's a little something in what we're talking to that you can go, oh, what's that? Don't worry if you don't understand it all. That's not necessary. It's just we're pointing to a different way of being, as you can hear the podcasts. And if something resonates, although even if you don't know what it is, then stay with that sense of resonance and curiosity, because you're onto something. So that's how I'd sort of leave it, listeners. And just get curious about it. Listen to it a couple of times. Check out some of the others. And if you want to and feel inclined, then get in touch with Kate and I. And I'm sure we'd both be very happy to have another conversation about anything that we've talked about in this.
Of course. Fantastic, Piers.
So, Kate, thank
you so much.
Thanks so much for your time.
Lovely to be here.
So thank you, Kate, for your time. Great conversation. Listeners, we're adding in a new little feature to make it even easier for you to share your views, comments, insights, and questions. And if you head over to www.sayhi.chat/QOM, that's sayhi.chat/QOM, you can leave us a little voice note, which is a super easy way for you to connect with us. And we might even then be able to respond to your voice note in the podcast. So ask us any questions about this episode or anything to do with the Quality of Mind podcast in general. We'd love to hear from you. And as usual, have fun being curious and keep exploring. Catch you on the next episode.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast and want to know more, check out our website at qualityofmind.biz. And also feel free to reach out and leave us a review or a comment. Until next time, have fun being curious.